Hi, Kevin Ledoux at Ledoux Guitars, the Pragmatic Luther. Today I'm making purfling. As you all know, purfling are these little wood strips that you use for inside the binding or around a rosette of a guitar. And I find these frustrating because you can't always buy them in any specie you want. And sometimes, even if you wanted them colored or dyed, you can't get them in necessarily the colors you want. So I have a system of making my own, and I thought I'd share it with you. Maybe this is something that you can use in your guitar shop as well. They're not that tough to make, but you got to have a drum sander. That's key to this whole process. The first thing you're going to need to do is make strips of whatever specie you want to make your purflings out of. And you want to cut those strips and drum sand those to a thickness that represents the width of your purfling. Now, I like my purfling to be a 1/16 of an inch wide. Don't confuse that with the width across the guitar, just the depth that it reaches down into the top or the back or whatever. Um, I like to go between a 1/16 and 5/64, but I suppose that's a personal choice. We'll get to the thickness a little bit later. But you'll need to make up several strips of this material, as I said, in whatever specie you want. And this sample piece is a little too narrow. I'd rather make this up 2.5 inches, 2.5 inches wide, because it's going to be a little easier to control in the end. But you'll see how this works out as we go along. So the first thing I did was I made these strips up, and in my case, I'm going to take this out of a set of clamps here and show you. I made strips out of, in this case, this is Purfling, and I have, you can see here, I have 5 strips, and I've got those at 5/64 of an inch thick, and I could only get about 1.5 inches wide out of this, so I'm stuck with what I have to deal with. So I'm going to change places with the camera so we can focus in on the details and you can see how all of this works. So after I get my strips made up, I want these all to be the same thickness, of course, and I want them to be the same width. What I'm going to do is take a stack of those and put them between 2 boards. Doesn't matter what the boards are. And I'm just going to put some clamping pressure on those. Can you see this clamp over here? And that's just to keep these tightened up and keep them gathered together. And I'm going to take a soft mallet and just tamp those down to make sure that the edges are all even. And before you make these strips up, try to do this with nice straight jointed edges, clean ripped edges, because they need to be very straight. All of these need to be consistent in thickness. So once I have these clamped up, now I'm going to take a nice long piece of masking tape and I'm going to tape these together at that edge. And it's pretty easy. You just follow along there. And I might mention that if you can have nice straight grain material, grain with a lot of run out or defective stuff doesn't work as well, because these strips are going to be very thin. So if you've got good clean material with straight grain, that's really going to help. Now, I could only make up a stack here of about a 1/2 inch thick. It's nicer if you can make up a stack that's, say, 3/4 of an inch thick, the same width as a piece of tape, or 1 inch thick, the same width as a piece of inch tape, because then you don't waste as much tape and you get more strips every time you make a cut. But I have to do what I have to do in this particular context. If I was doing this in maple, for example, I would have strips of maple that would be almost 3 inches wide, and I'd stack them up a full inch thick so that when I get done, I'd make a lot of these. And if you're going to make them, if at all possible, especially if you're doing them in a standard like maple or maybe walnut that you would use all the time, make them up by just a bunch of them. It's just as easy to make 300 of them as it is to make 25 of them. So while you're at it for the afternoon, you might as well maximize your effort. So now I'm just cutting that excess masking tape off there, and I can't do anything with it, so I guess we just have to toss that aside. So that's all taped down. And I'm going to release the clamps now and pull the stack out. Come on, let's release here. And I pulled the stack out, and I did this other side off camera, but you can see I now have both sides taped, and that's why it's important to make sure that both of these edges are clean, jointed, or planed edges. Uh, even sawn, if you got a good carbide blade and stuff, that'll cut a nice straight edge. That'll probably work out just nicely for you. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take rippings off of each one of these, and then we're going to come back and we're going to repeat the process. So a little closer look here. I have my sandwich of wood set up with the tape on it, as you can see, both edges. And to rip the strips that I need out of this, they need to be very, very thin. So I've set up a fence on my bandsaw. You could do this on any size bandsaw you want. I would not recommend doing this at a table saw at all. It's going to be just too aggressive for this kind of work. I have an auxiliary fence that I use with the fence on my bandsaw. The reason being that it allows me to get this upper guide down closer to the table, and it just helps guide that blade a little bit better. But I don't suppose it matters. You could do this with just whatever standard fence you happen to have. But this is easy to do. And of course, I did this myself because, after all, I'm the pragmatic Luther. Um, Now with blades, you can see I've got a pretty coarse blade on here. This is only about a 4 tooth per inch blade. A little coarse for my taste for this kind of work, but as you approach a 14 tooth blade, it almost gets to be ridiculous because the gullets are just going to clog up before they get a chance to clear, and your cut may not be as straight as you'd like it to be, even though you're trying to get a smoother cut. And you have to keep in mind that when you make these, we're going to end up with a strip that we're going to measure in thousandths of an inch, but you're going to cut it in fractions. There is a lot more dust on the floor when you get done than there is wood in your hand with these. That's the rule. The thinner you cut a piece of wood, the more waste it takes to make it in the first place. So what I've done is I've set my blade up, or my fence rather, and as you can see, for a very, very narrow cut. And in fact, that cut, as you can see here, I'm cutting a slice that's 3/64 of an inch thick. And even though that's a lot thicker than I'm going to drum sand to, I need it to be that thick just to get it through the saw without breaking things up, because it's just so thin in the first place. So there's the setup that we're after. We'll change scenes and we'll run a strip or two so that you can see how that goes, and then we'll go from there. Now that I've ripped that first strip from this stack of material, this edge is free and it's also rough. So what I've done here is I've just set this up between those two boards again. I've clamped it up and I've put it in my vise, and I'm going to hand plane that edge. Now you could do this with a jointer. You could probably do this with a jointer almost as easily, but you have to remember that since your material is so narrow, you're getting your hands, your fingers down pretty close to those knives, so it can be dangerous. That's why I prefer to do these in a strip that's about 3.5 inches wide if possible. It gets more dangerous as it goes down, but at least you got a good 1.5 inches to start with. But you can do this with a hand plane. Now, another way that you could do this is to make up a couple of, say, square material, square boards that are the same thickness as your sandwich of material. And by sandwiching those together and passing those through the drum sander each time you refine that edge, everything will come out, and those two square blocks, square boards, will hold that sandwich together for you, and you can make this work quite easily. I won't say that hand planing is always perfect. Sometimes it can be a little frustrating when you have grain direction changes. So sanding a lot of times is really a superior way to go. But I'm going to do this with a hand plane. Now that I have this all straightened out, of course, my next step is to come right back here with a strip of masking tape, and I'm going to mask that again. I'm just going to tape that off. Make sure that you stay with your edge so that you've got everything taped and thoroughly pressed down. Good contact is important. We're going to cut off the excess here. I don't know if you can see this real well. I hope so. So take the excess off. Get rid of that if you can get it off your fingers. And we're ready to make our next cut. So I'm going to take this back to the bandsaw, and I'm going to rip another one. And I'm sure you've already guessed, I'm going to repeat that process as many times as this sandwich of lumber will allow me to do. I'll take this out of the clamp so that you can see I'm back to where I was before, now just narrower. So I'm going to repeat this process. I'm going to rip another one on the bandsaw, then I'm going to refine that ripped edge, and then I'm going to rip and tape it, and then rip another one. I do not just go from one edge to the other because I don't want to lose my sandwich. I've got this gathered nicely. So this is always the edge that stays taped up, and the other edge I'll keep ripping from. So I'm going to do this a few hundred times more, and then we'll come back and see what the next step is. An addendum to what's happening here. I took the time because this sandwich of strips is getting very narrow and hard to control. They are still taped on the underside, but I took the time to just make a stick out of pine to set these into to hold the entire thing together so that I can keep cutting and refining. Now this needs to be drum sanded, so I'll tape it off after that and continue the process. But now this is going to allow me to just maintain control until I get everything out of this that it's going to yield. And I wanted to do that because this is expensive material, and I just want to get as much out of it as the material will allow me to get. So I've cut all of these strips, and you can see there's two different looks here. These are the ones that I was cutting just off the sandwich, and then when I inset that next batch in a strip of pine, they just all come out like this because I figured just let them all rip right out. But they're all the same thickness nevertheless. So now, because they're rough, they're not usable yet, but getting them down to dimension is not difficult because all you have to do is decide what thickness you want these purflings to be. Now, you may want a standard, 25 thousandths veneer thickness or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's what you're after that counts. I'm going to mill some of these down pretty thin, but most of them are going to remain at 25 thousandths of an inch thick. And it's easy to do because I'm just going to measure the thickness of this tape, which happens to be 5 thousandths of an inch. So if I want a 25 thousandths purfling, then I'm going to mill those. I'm going to drum sand them to 30 thousandths of an inch. And believe it or not, that works. You may think, well, you can't really do that with a drum sander, but you can. I've found in the past, I've had a jet sander, I've had a Performax sander, and I've had this Delta. And you can, if you're careful, and if you have the right equipment, you can tune these things up so that they'll be pretty accurate within a thousandth or two across the table. And another way you can hedge the bet on that, I'm going to move the camera over here a little. If you do, when you do your final pass and sanding, if there's any variance across the width of your table, if you send everything through a narrow band, say a 2-3 inch section of your sander, you got a better chance of holding everything exactly consistent. So, another quick addendum that I've discovered that could be very helpful. When you drum sand these strips down to your final thickness, keep a couple of sacrificial strips of anything. It doesn't matter what they are. And you'll find that if you bring your material very close to your thickness, let's say you want to end up at 30 thousandths and you're at 31, 32, 3, something like that, um, you may find that across your sander there will be a sweet spot. There's going to be a little bit of variation. It could be, I don't know, dust or dirt under or on the conveyor. Maybe there's some imbalance in the drum itself. Who knows? But you will be able to find a sweet spot. And I've noticed that when I find it, I just look at the letters on my sander and uh, hit say between these 2 points right here. And you can really refine these down to the point where you get them exactly the thickness that you want them. So my final step now is to get the tape off this stuff. And it can be kind of a pain to get it started, but it'll happen. And see, when you peel it off, sometimes it doesn't want to come off. You just have to keep scraping at it. But you can get the tape off eventually. And when you do, you'll have all of these strips. And as you can see, I'm kind of struggling here, but we'll get it off sooner or later. Now, you take all of the tape off that and you've got your strips. You will experience some breakage. Here's a piece. I knew this was going to break because I could see a nick in the piece before I even sent it through the sander. So you expect some of that. If you have real nice straight grain material, you'll probably get a little bit less, but it does happen. But you may even find that these short pieces you can use to go, around a sound hole, or maybe if you're going to bind and purfle a headpiece or something, you keep all of that stuff. So it's all very useful. So there's a basic rundown on how you can make purfling. Um, I got 70 strips out of the piece of material I started with, and I had, I think, 3 of them broke. So, you get 65, 68 strips, 67, something like that. But you get it in whatever specie you want, and you get it in whatever thickness, whatever dimensions you want altogether. I make purfling in several species. I have Padauk, I have cherry, I have black walnut, um, I have some African mahogany here, and I make up a lot of maple. When I make maple strips, I'll make these up sometimes 300 or 400 at a time because I put these in vats and I'll dye them to whatever colors that I figure I want them. So I figured out quickly to make what I made today cost me about 37 feet of 3/4 inch masking tape, if that means anything to you. And to make this much material was a little difficult because I was fiddling with the video, but I would judge that back to an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours of work to make all of this stuff up. But I just looked it up, and purfling strips are running around $2.30, $2.36 a piece at some big Western supplier. They might be cheaper elsewhere. I don't know because I haven't bought any of this stuff in 25 years. I've been making all of my own and doing so quite successfully. So I don't, it's not so much that I don't think you should spend your money at a Luther supply house as it is if you want a particular species, you can get whatever you want by making your own. Now, you may say, well, if you've got a dark color like this, what difference does it make whether it's walnut or palfero or whatever it is? But if you look closely at your purfling schemes and what can be done and how it actually shows up in the final work, it does make quite a difference. And I've even found that in thin little strips like this of purfling, if you make those up in curly maple, even that edge, when the light hits it under a finish, it will reflect that that nice chatoyance that you may be looking for. So there it is. I'm the pragmatic luthier, Kevin Ledoux at Ledoux Guitars. I hope you'll put a like on the video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope this has been useful to you in your guitar making. Thanks again.